February means no more transfers until May or until June, July. It also means return of the Champions League, normally getting into more squeaky bum time in the league. I can't believe how quickly this month has gone. But yeah, an opportunity, Dan, for us to chat transfer window today, a very peculiar transfer window. And we've got Arel Nazmir from our data science team at 21st Club, who's crunched all the numbers, and yeah, looking forward to getting stuck into some interesting insights today, reviewing the window. So Arel, lead us off. What were some of the headlines from the January window, which was a bit of an unusual one in many ways?
Yeah, thanks again for having me on. So yeah, as you say, Omar, it's obviously been a very peculiar window for a number of reasons. We saw the kind of impact of COVID a little bit last summer in the transfer window, and I think we're beginning to see some of the longer term effects that COVID is having this January. So it's been the lowest spending window since 2012. Kind of Big Five spending is down by about 66% from last January. So it's down from 730 million to about 230 million. So we're seeing big drop-offs, and the same is true in the Premier League. It's been the first window since 2012 as well, actually, that there's been no signings above 25 million. And there's actually been only 2 signings above 20 million if we kind of, I think Benrahma and Diallo as well that were signed. So it's definitely been a lot more quiet window that then we're kind of used to as well. And another interesting kind of fact is that Real Madrid as well haven't made a signing since 2019. So, you know, the big Galacticos of the noughties are really, really quiet. And when that happens, you know, something's definitely up. So, yeah, I think it's been a very quiet window, but also it's not only been COVID. If you combine the effects that Brexit's beginning to have on clubs as well, I think something that we'll touch on later on, it's definitely had a kind of double whammy effect as on this window. And yeah, I think we'll probably see more of the same in the summer as well.
Yeah, the 25 million pound stat one is the kind of one that amazed me, because it probably wasn't that long ago that 25 million became the kind of almost like lower benchmark for. I remember when it used to be 25 million. I remember when Chelsea signed Shevchenko for 30 million. It was like, oh bloody hell, there's a lot of money there on the striker. But that's obviously all changed now. Now 25 million is kind of going rate. And actually, one of the pieces of analysis that we've done, Arel, isn't it, where we've looked at transfer as a proportion of club revenue. And if you're a kind of, you know, Man United, Bayern Munich, Real Madrid, and so on, the 25 million would represent roughly 5%, maybe a bit less of your revenues, which is typically what you would spend on a fringe player or a squad player. And the fact that clubs aren't signing those types of players, I think, is really, really notable. They've just basically decided to make do with the squads that they have this window.
Yeah, and maybe if I can just mention one point there, Omar, as well, which is the general picture. Like we had the Deloitte report out last week, I think, if that's right. We had various financial accounts out from across some of the biggest clubs, Barcelona, Real Madrid, as Ariel mentioned, and obviously a lot of the UK clubs from a revenue and cost perspective. We've seen, you know, Barcelona, obviously big losses, Real Madrid, big losses, even clubs like Brighton, I think, have come out with quite big losses relatively recently, among others. And that's obviously a lot has to do with COVID and lack of match day and commercial revenues, and obviously some broadcasting rebates and all of that. And I feel that, you know, in the summer we had that period, didn't we, where everyone was a bit outraged that so much money was being spent in the midst of what was this, you know, global pandemic, and everyone was, you know, had this idea of how clubs are able to sustain themselves with spending these huge amounts of money. And here we are, at the beginning of February, effectively, well, in a way, I guess, I mean, I don't know whether this is the case or not, clubs showing a lot more rationality, maybe a forced rationality, than they otherwise would necessarily have done in other climates, simply because they're having to tighten belt strings at a very strong level. But I wonder whether there's a few other sort of elements in the pie. We've talked about, Omar, previously, like, for example, a re-equilibrium, a sort of restabilization of the market in terms of value of players, of not being able to get players off the books because they're on pretty high wages, on sort of the new normal in terms of wages and transfer fees, and it taking a while for that sort of valuation shock to flow through the industry.
Yeah. What were the numbers? Because I know you looked at this. What were the numbers on like player average transfer fee versus what we might have expected?
Yeah, exactly, Omar. So I think it's the first window since 2012 where our valuation model will kind of states that the players were kind of being traded out very, very closely to what they actually went for. So historically, the kind of January window, you tend to pay a premium. And over the past couple of seasons, actually, since 17-18, it's been at about 30%. So it's actually been a lot higher than what players are actually worth. But as I say, this window, it's actually been clubs playing signing players for around 7% less than what they're actually valued at. So, you know, as you say, the market in a way is actually correcting itself a little bit more, but also selling clubs are a bit more kind of, they have that position where perhaps they might need to sell a player and they're more than happy to kind of, you know, sell him for slightly less, slightly closer to his actual market value, as opposed to kind of waiting to get that premium, because there isn't that luxury anymore that we're seeing, as a lot of clubs are kind of implementing austerity measures across the board. So yeah, it's been a lot closer to what players are actually worth this window.
Yeah, I remember you doing a piece of analysis looking at particularly the last week of the window, which tends to be like a massive premium in January because yeah, it's kind of all this real panic buying. Then I saw a quote, I think it was from Per Mertesacker the other day, he kind of acknowledged he himself was a panic buy for Arsenal, which I wonder what it's like being a footballer if you're a panic buy, how you kind of view yourself. But interestingly, Dan, there weren't premiums on players, and so you take a club like Liverpool, who we probably talk about too much on this show, but we do for very good reasons, paying very little fees for the two centre backs they signed. Not only that, but also very little upfront.
Exactly. So it was just one of the things that fascinated me is that, you know, hopefully other guests that we can get on, we might be able to try and think about getting on sporting directors or scouts or agents or otherwise. And I was almost trying to put myself in the position of Michael Edwards, the sporting director, and actually just think behind the scenes, you know, was it the case that Liverpool were under pretty huge financial constraints and therefore he didn't have that much money to play with? And he's pulled a couple of rabbits out of the hat, or was it like it was reported that we did make some Liverpool did make some larger offers for particular players, but they were rejected for various reasons? One from Marseille, perhaps, that we can talk about in a little bit of time in terms of the French market. But the fascinating thing again is another trend I think you're seeing that I think Liverpool seem from the outside to be doing pretty well at is paying, or potentially paying, or rather paying rather small first transfer installments, i.e. it might well be that the overall transfer fee is slightly larger because that's the playoff that you take in terms of putting less up front, almost like when you buy your car on PCP or whatever the equivalent might be. You're probably using a bad analogy there. But in the same way, what, you know, Liverpool seems to have done pretty well is be on the upside of two deals. One is for Davies, who's out of contract in 6 months, only putting £500,000 down for what presumably will be a fourth or fifth choice centre back. But you know, you guys know it better than I. As soon as he's got Liverpool on his CV, that amount probably doubles, triples, quadruples, and if it doesn't work out for him in a year or so, or 18 months or 2 years, then Liverpool probably make a decent profit out of him. The same way with Kabak, which is, you know, one of the top under 21 scouted defenders in some of the top European league, one of the top European leagues, and they've managed to pay a relatively small loan fee without an obligation, a crystallized obligation to buy in the summer, which is, you know, more or less a 5-month audition. If it doesn't work out, he goes back. If he does well and acclimatizes, then Liverpool will pay whatever it is, the 16 to 18, 20 million euro mark to get it over the line.
Yeah, I think those two deals are really interesting just from a couple of dynamics. So you're absolutely right on Davies in that now that he's a Premier League player, like just by default, like he's got a much higher transfer fee, and we see that quite a lot, even in the data where you see a player sold from the Premier League tend to come at a premium to other Premier League clubs, and so it's almost like the biggest no-brainer in a way. And the other thing that Liverpool have got in the bank is that they've recruited so well over the last 3-4 years that if you're another club in the Premier League, you're going, okay, Davies didn't work out at Liverpool, but they identified him, so he's probably a pretty good player, and that gives you confidence when you might go and recruit that player, or think about recruiting that player. And then on Kabak, obviously it's a 5-month shop window, but the good thing for Schalke is that, okay, Liverpool haven't got an obligation to buy, but the fact that he's been playing for Schalke, who've been probably the worst team in the Big Five leagues in the last year. I mean, they've been horrendous. So it's difficult to shine for a team like that. But now playing for Liverpool, if he gets run of games, with Matip now out for the season, like even if Liverpool decide, oh, he's not for us, he's been playing in the Premier League, and again, that comes with an additional value. So it's kind of win-win for everyone, a deal like that. I remember when Monaco loaned Yuri Tielemans to Leicester. Again, a really wise move, I thought, because it took him from Monaco, wasn't it? And he went to the Premier League, performed well in those 6 months. Everyone could benefit there because Leicester could see his quality in the Premier League. Monaco could get him in an attractive league to raise his value, and then everyone can kind of decide what a fair price for him is with a great degree of confidence. So there's a lot more kind of tactics that we're seeing in the window.
And if I can mention just a couple of other brief points, then obviously we can go back to the much better, insightful analysis from Oriel than me. But the bit that I also find interesting was, it's almost hedging. Liverpool are hedging their bets on that and not continuing the trend too much, which is, it's reported that Upamecano at Red Bull is maybe their big target for the summer. They're effectively, I don't know, I'm using automotive things so much today, but they're basically test driving him for, a few months, seeing if it works out. And he would obviously be the cheaper alternative to a much more expensive potential player. So I think that's an interesting one. And I think the other thing is just to, not like I need to talk about Paul Merson too much in his analysis, but I found his analysis yesterday of Kabak and others just quite interesting because, this whole confirmation bias, just as you talked about, of Schalke obviously doing terribly in the league, that doesn't mean they don't have good players playing for them. And you talked about it, Omar, in a way when you said, about players that can obviously step up inside a better team. And, Liverpool are the exact prime recruitment example of that. They've had players that have basically been relegated from the Premier League that have excelled at Liverpool as a result. I mean, Gini Wijnaldum, I was seeing a statistic today, over 200 games, has got the best ever points per game ratio out of any Liverpool player in history. And the same, with Shaqiri to a degree, and the same with Robertson, obviously. So it's sometimes, I think, less about the team and more about the player and how you recruit the player. And obviously Schalke being in a vulnerable position makes it of value to Liverpool in that respect.
Yeah, definitely. What were the stats on loan deals? Because I think Liverpool's probably the headline one, but there were quite a few, weren't they, in the window?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very interesting, the Liverpool one in general, because I feel like, they kind of went into the window in one of the worst positions, and obviously they're chasing probably the title this season, and they've actually come out fit with 2 very good players, and as Dan says, for very little money. So they've kind of been forced into the market, but not forced into any deals. So I think that's been, a testament to the type of recruitment strategies at Liverpool for the past couple of years. But loans in general, I think there's been a tendency, or it's been changing the dynamics of in the transfer windows quite a lot over the past couple of years. So I think this window we saw 60% of all deals are actually loans. So historically, that's been around 45% or just less than half. So more than half of the deals this window are actually loan deals. So that's just been a kind of a small trend we've seen this January window. But also the value of those players has actually been a lot higher. So we're seeing players loaned out that are perhaps not 19, 20-year-olds, but players like Jesse Lingard or other kind of more senior players. So they're actually being loaned out later on in their career. And this is actually shown as well in terms of the average age of loan players. It's actually increased to about 26, whereas historically it's been closer to 24. And we've also seen in some of the data as well, actually, that loan players, the percent of minutes that they actually play is actually increasing as well. So between 2010 and 2014, and the last 4 years, it's actually increased by 7%. So, we're seeing more senior players go out on loan and players that are worth more. We're also seeing more loans in the transfer window in general. And as Dan says, in a way that kind of gives you an insurance policy. And as you mentioned, with Yuri Tielemans, in a way, it allows you to kind of pick up a player and see how well they might do. And never has that been more important than now during COVID, where clubs can't kind of be the kind of, they can't be forced, if they make a mistake, it's a lot more costly than it perhaps might have been in other windows. So I think that's an interesting trend that we'll begin to see more of. And obviously Italy's been known for doing a lot of loan to buy obligations and their co-ownership, and obviously a lot of the rules and regulations around that have changed. But I think it's a very, very interesting area that we're going to begin to see more of, I think, moving forward, definitely.
Yeah, I wonder if, obviously, a lot of players might have signed long-term deals in summer 2019 on 4 or 5 year deals, and they're difficult to shift at the moment. FIFA, the one thing that strikes me is FIFA want to change regulations around loans and limiting the movement of loan players essentially to prevent hoarding of players. But I almost feel like they're probably going to have to kick back some of those regulations, because at the moment it's the only outlet for a lot of clubs, and if you restrict the ability for clubs to loan out players, then you're potentially restricting, or you're enforcing them to incur costs that they don't want to incur, and that they can spread elsewhere. So yeah, that'll be an interesting. I wonder if FIFA are studying those movements and thinking about how their regulations might change.
I think the other bit, Omar, that we've talked about is the B word. I know we talked about it a little bit before, the Brexit word, and how that has impacted in the window. But before I just go on Brexit, the other bit that would be quite interesting, I know we talked about in prep before, was sort of the communications, the comms that comes out of clubs to effectively provide advantage in a negotiation position, or a disadvantage to make things more difficult to be able to buy and sell players. And we were talking before about that a little bit. I'm not sure whether, Omar, if you feel sort of comfortable just to talk about how sometimes more clubs can be possibly more joined up in their approach and the messaging about needing players or wanting to sign players, and how that sort of comes into the wider sort of holistic piece.
Yeah, so you mentioned obviously Joel Matip's injury wasn't announced until after the signings, and I must admit, when I saw Liverpool 2 centre backs, they really need 2 centre backs. Matt Phillips did pretty well against West Ham, and then you see Joel Matip's out for the season. You go, oh, okay, that's why. But that's exactly how you should play it, because if they'd announced it beforehand, then Preston or Schalke go, right, the price has increased by 100%, or the loan fee or whatever. So that's definitely the way to play it. I think the other way to play it, the wrong way to play it, is arguably being what we saw from West Brom during the window, with Sam Allardyce, coming out and saying we need players. It's harder in this market because of Brexit. I think that just narrows your negotiating position so sharply. And I know of clubs that have clauses in the contracts of their managers that restrict their ability to talk about transfers in press conferences, basically. And I think it's it's a very wise move, because everyone sees it, everyone talks about it, and I think Liverpool have probably we've praised them so much on this show around their recruitment, but like I've never seen a team keep such a poker face in the public, and clearly in private as well in negotiations. So yeah, no, fair play to them. I think they've played a blinder again. On Brexit, so on Sam Allardyce and Brexit, is it easy or hard to pull apart the impact of Brexit and the points-based system on the market?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Omar. So I think it's going to begin to have more of an impact, obviously long term. But even in this first window, I think we've already beginning to see a slight shift. So the proportion of transfers from other big leagues actually increases 20%. Again, historically, it's been about 50%, and that's actually deviated. So what signings from other European leagues has actually dropped. So you can see clubs already beginning to focus a lot of their recruitment strategies around clubs in the Big Five, where players to get GB points. And obviously this is the first window, so it will begin to be more noticeable long term. So yeah, I'd say we're already beginning to see a shift in that. It's interesting, actually, Sam Allardyce that you mentioned. I remember him at the beginning of January kind of crying out that West Brom are dying out for a striker. They've got Callum Robertson as their only kind of senior striker, but they're desperate for goals. And it's interesting, actually, because they've looked at a few targets that Allardyce was quite keen to kind of move forward with. But actually, as a result of Brexit, he very clearly said that we couldn't make any more progress on those players. So if West Brom were to go down, it might not be because of that, but they've actually been missing out on targets because of that. And he was saying himself that it's probably the most difficult window that he's been in, combining the effects of Brexit as well as COVID as well. So yeah, we're beginning to see an impact already. It's interesting. Cassioda, I think, signed for Brighton. He's obviously a very, very kind of highly rated player coming from Ecuador. Man United were very close to signing him, I think, but Brighton ended up getting him, and he just about passes the GBE point system on about 17 points. So he's likely to kind of get game time very soon. But I think what's another kind of interesting impact of Brexit is the kind of recruitment in South America. So at the minute, Copa Libertadores is actually ranked as a Category 1 continental competition, and what that basically means is it's ranked the same as the Champions League. So if a player gets a decent amount of minutes in this competition, or even gets to kind of a round of 16, round of 30, quarterfinal, etc., they can actually accumulate a big proportion of the 15 points needed to actually qualify for GBE. So I think we actually might see a shift in the long term in more clubs recruiting from South America and probably less from, let's say, Eastern Europe, where it's perhaps a lot more difficult for a club to be playing in Europe. And even so, players probably playing for a weak national team, so they'll struggle for points there. It's interesting, actually, on the Cassioda one. I think Brighton have actually built a relationship with the club that they've signed him from, so they're very keen to build those relationships in South America, where obviously they're going to be a lot more important moving forward.
Yeah,
apart from Oriel taking my job as the work permit expert, which I'm not very happy about right now, seeing as you articulated a lot better than I've done in previous ones. Yeah, I think just as a reminder to everybody, I think the interesting nugget of all of that now is, whereas before we had this free movement for EU workers coming in, where it didn't matter which club you were at all. If you had that EU passport, you were in. It didn't matter. It was that straightforward. Whereas now, it's just everything becomes more frictionful, or whatever the word is, full of friction. It takes more effort to be able to work out for a non-UK player how they're going to be employed by the club. In one way, it's slightly easier because, as you said, Oriel, actually what clubs are we looking at is the top 5 leagues and a few other leagues. And if you've played Copa Libertadores or you've played Champions League and you've played in a couple of matches in those leagues, you're likely to get in. But it's still a lot more admin and burdensome to be able to go through that analysis piece. And I've done it on quite a few occasions over this window to relative degrees of success. But I think that's the really important thing now. Whereas before, scout a European player, does he have a European passport? Fine, let's do it. And that was obviously Allardyce's approach. Now it's a lot more nuanced. You're going to have to go through that analysis piece if they're not a regular in the national teams.
Yeah, I think the counterpoint to Allardyce would be the point system is set up so that if a player is below 15 points, they're not good enough for the Premier League, and they shouldn't be signing for West Brom. That's essentially how it's been designed and tested. You can argue whether that's true for all players, and so whilst he may come out and say, "Oh, there's certain players that we wanted to sign, but they didn't score enough points," he might have actually saved the club a bit of money there on players that weren't good enough. That's the count. I'm not necessarily saying that that is the case, because I think there probably are players particularly younger players who fall beneath the 15 points threshold and are good enough for Premier League clubs. But yeah, he might have saved the club a bit of money. Just lastly, I think penultimately was on Liga, which just today also reports on they didn't meet the reserve price after MediaPro pulled out. So it was Amazon, DAZN, I think another streaming OTT. Who was it? Sorry,
Discovery maybe was they involved?
Yeah, possibly. But essentially, yeah, the French football not bringing in the broadcast money at the moment. A lot of clubs in a lot of trouble. Broadcast money in the big 5 leagues, the big income stream for all the clubs there. Did we see a shift in the window in the dynamics around Liga, Oriel?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. As you say, it's obviously been feeling the effects very strongly of COVID, and I think part of the reason for that it was the only Big Five league last season to actually be cancelled very prematurely. It seemed like they kind of made a mistake, but very, very quickly in that. And then obviously this season it struggled with the TV deal, and that's going to affect clubs across the board. Probably less so PSG, I imagine, but obviously I think you'll begin to see some of the effects. It's not been the case that more clubs have been signing players from Liga in this window, but I think in the future we'll definitely see more of that. I mean, this window, Liga actually had a positive net balance, which was the first time this had happened since 2013. So they tend to spend a bit more than they kind of receive, but not in this window. And we've seen obviously Aston Villa sign Sanson, I think a midfielder from Marseille, in this window, and apparently Marseille, they were forced into making that decision because of the financial struggles. And the longer this lasts in Liga, I think we'll begin to see more and more clubs begin to target players from Liga. And there's obviously a big pool of talent from there to choose from. And obviously, if you combine the effects of Brexit with that, more clubs will be looking at that league anyway. So I think it's a very interesting one that we perhaps haven't seen too much change in this window, but definitely moving towards the summer and the next 12 months in general, I think we're going to see more and more involvement in this area.
Yeah, might not be a Big Five league. It's already kind of between being a Big Four and a Big Five, isn't it? And I think if the clubs aren't receiving the broadcast money, then they might struggle to retain their players at the younger ages and see them go to Spain and England and so on when they're kind of 21, 22. But yeah, interesting one to track. And just to wrap up, who do you think had a good windows? We've spoken about Liverpool. Were there others that kind of came out of it well?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, perhaps not from a buying perspective, but in terms of releasing players. And I think this is a point Dan mentioned earlier around, I think Arsenal have actually done okay in terms of kind of getting rid of some players on very high wages, as Messi, Man United, releasing, Rojo's now left. So, those kind of savings in terms of wages are going to be very, very important for clubs, even those clubs at the top of the table. So I think that those clubs have done well, and a number of other teams that have been able to kind of release those big earners. But across the board, because there hasn't actually been too many transfer signings, there wasn't any clubs that actually came out that did spectacularly well in general. But I think those clubs that were able to release some of those big earners are actually making the kind of necessary steps to perhaps be a bit more active in the summer should they need to.
Yeah, I think that was the big thing that came out of the summer window, is that the amount of sales was massively down. Clubs struggled to get rid of players. So I suppose that was the number one objective in this window for clubs. But in a lot of cases, it's just been temporary because it's just loans, and they're hoping to put players in the shop window, I suppose, for a period of time. But I think the challenge is if a player goes out on loan and then doesn't perform on loan, then you've almost got a double problem, because it's no longer an issue of the player at that club, an issue with the player at any club. And I think that's where clubs run into difficulties if they're repeat failure of loans. So it'll be interesting to see how someone like a Jesse Lingard, for example, or some of the Arsenal players have been loaned out, how they do. Because if they fail, then suddenly their value tanks even more.
No, agreed. Well, guys, we're at the half an hour mark. It was great to chat footy as always, and fascinating to hear some insights from Oriel. Omar, please give him his appearance fee and his image rights royalty payment, and maybe we'll try and get him back on if we can afford him next time.
Yeah, I know a good lawyer can sort him out on those contracts.
Thanks a lot for having me on, guys, again.
Cheers, Oriel. Thanks, Dan.
Take care, everyone.